Now the folks who were invited was everybody, but specifically we had specific people invited. We had Mary invited, and we had his brothers were invited. They're mentioned specifically in the text. But what's not mentioned is Joseph. So Joseph doesn't appear in the Gospels after Jesus went to the temple when he was 12 and was left behind, and that's the last time Joseph is mentioned. And so it's presumed that Joseph died and was no longer on the scene. And so I'm going to speculate here and say that Jesus' sisters were there, though they weren't mentioned, and probably half the town of Cana for sure, and many from Nazareth, because there were a lot of interaction between those two towns. Okay, I went into all that stuff. And I would presume that the family of the groom and the bride were known by Mary's family, and many members of the families were recruited to help on various times. And I have no idea how a multi-day event would have been structured. But I imagine that multi-days mean that if you have members of the community helping, that the groom had organized groups to serve at different times. They would be the guests at certain times, and other times they would be acting as the servants. That's what makes sense to me, but I don't know, maybe he hired a bunch of servants for the whole time, but I find that unlikely, because Cana was a small town. It's unlikely that in an agriculture small town that he could have gathered in a year the wherewithal to do such a thing. That would happen in big cities with richer folk around, and they'd flaunt it. And so, returning to the text, verse 3. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "We have no more wine." This is a social blunder on many levels. There's an expectation that the groom was going to be able to provide for the entire event. So this is a mishap that would be remembered for a long time in the close-knit community that was there. It's a social black eye for the groom and the bride. People would be saying, "Yeah, for long she married that guy who couldn't provide for the banquet." It was in effect the groom saying, "I can't provide for my bride," and it would cause lots of chattering. What is the bride's family thinking in pairing her with this fella? Or were they thinking improving that ne'er-do-well boy? You know, that was the sort of thing that would be going on. But we have a narrative now. So first we have the social blunder that is a problem. And Mary, presumably friends of the family, perhaps in the wedding, she notices it. And she comes to Jesus. And so we have a conversation here. I want to go through the conversation first and come back to all this. Because the conversation, well, see for yourself, does it not sound odd? She says, "They have no more wine." Jesus says, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." So his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." 3 lines for the entire conversation. It appears right off that Jesus doesn't really address her concern. And even though he says something that doesn't seem to address her concern, she immediately turns around and tells the servants, "Hey, do whatever he tells you." As if he did answer her. clarity comes to this conversation when we look at the relationship Mary had with Jesus. It is a unique relationship in all of history. There is no woman that had a relationship like Mary had to her son. And so let me see if I can flesh this out a little bit for you. Exodus 20:12 says, and there's Exodus 20. Honor your father and your mother, so you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving to you. A command in the 10 Commandments to honor your mother and father. Jesus never sinned. He honored his mother always. Not a time he didn't. And so we have some clues to some of the things that are going on in our relationship. If we go and look at Luke chapter 2. Luke is big in our study of this. Luke had a lot to say about Mary. Apparently, Luke 2. Luke interviewed Mary, most likely, because he has an awful lot of details that seemingly would not come from any other source or would have a common source. So 2:19 says, this is to put in context, this is where the shepherds came to the birth of Jesus and told all of what they saw, right? And it says in 19, but Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. In 21, on the 8th day, I'm sorry, that's wrong one. Turning over to verse 40 in chapter 2. They took him, the context is they took him to be circumcised on the 8th day as the law required. And it says in verse 40, and the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. And then in 2 verses 48 through 52, it says this. When he was 12 years old, it uses the term parents twice, plural, meaning Joseph was with them. And then he says, they went and they found him, and his mother said to him, this is verse 48, son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Why were you searching for me? He asked. Didn't you know that I had to be in my father's house? But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and in favor with God and man. I'm going somewhere with this. The relationship that Mary had with Jesus was unique in this way, in that Jesus never sinned. When Mary said, hey, can you grab something out of a cupboard? He went and grabbed it out of the cupboard, and he didn't gripe. He never once talked back. He wasn't rebellious in any way to his parents. And then, sometime after he was 12 years old, his father dies. And at that point, the firstborn, which would be Jesus in his family, has to take on the responsibilities of the father to care for the well-being of his mother. And he grew in wisdom and stature. And so, as he grew, and he was in this position of head of household, Mary would turn to Jesus, her obedient son, to where their conversations were probably much more clear in that there wasn't any shading of truth. He was straightforward and guileless with her. And so their communication was much deeper, and fewer words probably had to be said, as we see in this passage. But he was her problem solver. She relied on his wisdom. If she ever had a problem, she'd turn to Jesus, hey, what should I do? You know what? He was a wise fellow. He grew in wisdom and stature, and he would solve the problems. And that's a lot like what Mary is doing here. She is saying, they have no more wine. He's bringing a problem to her problem solver. And then Jesus answers in a strange way. And because we're close to the end of 10 minutes, I'm going to stop it and start it again in just a minute. We're going to find out what Jesus was saying.